Okay, let's wait for the attendees to join us. So that we can start in just a few minutes. Okay, let's start the event. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Flavia Gasbarri. I am lecturer in the World Studies Department at King's College London, and I am the co-chair of the Africa Research Group, which is the organizer of this event. This event is part of the annual KCL Africa Week, co-organized by the Africa Research Group and by the Africa Leadership Center. So today we are here for the launch event of the book Africa in Global History, and I'm very happy to chair this event. First of all, because I'm one of the contributors to the book, so I saw the birth and the development of the book. And secondly, because I am here with, I have the great pleasure to be here today with a terrific panel, which includes the two editors of the book, of course, as well as other contributors. So what we're going to do today, we are going, first of all, to hear from the two editors. They will briefly introduce the general book, its aim, its development, and so on. And then we're going to, and then every contributor will present their own chapter. So let me introduce you the two contributors, editors. First of all, Professor Toyin Omoyeni Falola, who is an historian and professor of African Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. His research interest is in African history since the 19th century. And his thematic fields include Atlantic history, diaspora and migration, empire and globalization, intellectual history, international relations, religion, and culture. Professor Falola is the author and editor of more than 100 books, so he has extensively researched and published on these topics, and is, of course, one of the two editors of the book we are presenting today. And then we have Professor Mohammed Bashir Salaam from the University of Mississippi. His research interest explores the history of slavery in the 19th century and early 20th century in West Africa, and specifically the use of slaves on plantation. He's the author of two books. The first one, The West African Slave Plantation, a Case Studies, published in 2011. And the second one, Plantation Slavery in the Sokoto Caliphate, an Historical and Comparative Study, published in 2018. Okay, so thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours, and thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you very much, Flavia, for organizing this. Without you and your interest, we will not be here. Your afternoon, my morning. I would like to start this conversation, not from Africa, but from Ukraine. And you will see how Ukraine illustrates many of the important points in this book. And there are many things, many angles by which I can look at it. First, the student's angle. I never knew that there were 8,000 students in Ukraine, but for the crisis. And that by itself raises an issue of knowledge, relevance, globalism, because many of them are not on scholarship. So how do you have 1,000 students from a place you call developing, paying school fees? And they are going there because it's cheaper than Western Europe. I never knew that. But that raises the fundamental of this moment. I knew there were students in the US. My school is one of the second largest in terms of foreign students. I knew they were in England. So how many Africans are, say, in Western societies, in school alone? Suppose they're in thousands. That is a summary of what this book is about, in which the acquisition of knowledge historically has always been there. The impact of the Bible on Africa, the impact of the Quran on Africa. And people do not know that there were African Islamic missionaries in North Africa and the Middle East. Just as Mansa Musa went to Mecca in the 13th century, imams from Africa went to the Middle East, went to Africa to preach and to set up madrasas. People don't talk about that. Second, Ukraine has exposed the various reactions. And these various reactions, they've constructed a world, a global world, the world against Russia, the world against Russia. But that world did not extend to Africa. Ethiopia has passed through a major crisis. The world did not extend there. When the Hutu and Tutsi were killing one another, 1 million within a few weeks, the world did not extend there. The Sahel is imploding. The world does not extend there. Boko Haram, thousands of people have been killed. The world does not extend there. So our interrogation of the world is very complex. But in that interrogation of the world, it is highly racialized. Remember, this area where they were fighting, an argument arose in the very early modern. Should they take them to Americas as slaves? It used to be one of the slave baskets, but they were considering the possibility of moving them in millions to the New World. Why did they not move them? David Eltis, in an award-winning book, raised an argument about Christianity and values. And the way he structured it, you will see it today as the Ukrainian crisis unfolds. They made the arguments that they were Christians, they were white. Why do you want to enslave people who look like you? If you see the racialized conversation today, there was a time I was crying. I was so sad, I was crying that Ukrainians look like us. They have blue eyes. These are not Afghan. These are not Iraqi. These are not Africans. They said it openly. They were not, this is something you should say in private. They said it openly. And that reminded me of the conversation in the 16th and 17th century. Why didn't you move Slavs into the Atlantic world? So why do you allow the Hutu to kill the Tutsi and you are not allowing the Slavs to kill Slavs? And that tells you about racial constructions in the 19th century, in the way in which Africa became part of what we call the world and the global economy. In Wallenstein's argument, a role was assigned to Africa: produce raw materials. In Adam Smith's argument, check their resources. Today, 85 billions. 85 billions. I'm a member of the committee that studies this, leaves Africa every year as illicit transfer, illicit wealth transfer. We set up a commission to do this, and we calculate it at 85 billion. So these are tropes that have been there, in which this And that trope that Africa receives modernity, but it doesn't give modernity, has been there. Gandhi's book successfully relates how the Atlantic slave trade redefined modernity in Europe. If you say the continent is irrelevant, look at how this irrelevant continent has become the principal agency in changing the dynamics of politics in Europe and the US today. Without Mexicans, without Africans, Trump would not have emerged as president. Because part of how he emerged, why he's emerged, is that these shithole countries, these 20 million Mexicans are overwhelming us. And then you have anti-foreignization argument, you have anti-immigrant argument, you have xenophobic argument. What about Brexit? On the one hand, you say Africa is not an agency, but you cannot understand Brexit without Arabs and Africans. And you cannot understand Peckham in England without the African agency. And that African agency has always been there, in which a continent, since the early modern, has shown that with massive data that is part of the world. It may be marginalized, but has been part of the world. Then you have the older arguments, the Constitution of Africa, the Arab Constitution of Africa, the European Leo Frobenius Constitution of Africa. The person that we should thank, and we never thank him enough, in the world and Africa, Du Bois was one very notion of Africa we use today. We owe it to Du Bois, because his argument is, don't use the code, Africa south of the Sahara. That's a code for blackness. And if you see the way we teach Africa in the US, including my classes, we've edited out the entire North Africa. In the American Academy, we take the Washington, DC definition of Africa. Africa minus North Africa. Programs in the US, North Africa and the Middle East. North Africa and the Middle East. That's the way they do it, in which they relocated Egypt outside of Africa. They connected Tunisia with Southern Europe, Morocco with the Middle East. And that in itself reveals this way of thinking in which that continent, in which you say, I'm going to take out of the continent the Semitic Caucasian aspect and leave it to blackness. And once you do it that way, you begin to see the very consequences. This book, and I will leave the portion of the introduction to Professor Salaam. I will not mention that, so that he can talk about many of the main points in the book. I'm just going beyond the book itself. So you find Gujarat, India. You find China. These have been there. The Chinese got to Africa, knew about Africa, sometimes a long time ago. Some people have argued even before the Europeans did. The Silk trade connected Africa. Cairo was the metropolitan city of the world, combining trade from different parts of the world. Historically, the Indian Ocean has been the connecting point. How did the blacks get to India, to China, to the Persian world? Where was Jesus Christ before the age of 30? 4 of the Gospels were written in Africa, most especially that of Mark, in which that connection, and in a mythical proportion, the 2 longest dynasties in Africa, the Safawa dynasty, the Solomonic dynasty. The Solomon dynasty was connected to Israel, to the Old Testament, to Solomon, the Queen of Sheba's story. It took science, it took DNA to know that there were Jewish people in Ethiopia, which they relocated back to Israel. And that story produced the Solomon dynasty, one of the longest dynasties in African history. Those connections have been there. And you find how in the Islamic world, Africa was part of it after the 11th century. It has always been part of it. The transatlantic slave trade from the early modern to the 19th century was global history. Global history in the Atlantic connection of it, in the exchange of people, in the exchange of ideas, in trafficking of all sorts of products. If you go to Ijebu today in Nigeria and you tell them cassava is not indigenous, their main food is gari. That's what they consume. If you were to tell them cassava is not indigenous, they will argue with you that it's indigenous. It's not. It's from Brazil. If you go to Eastern Nigeria, their delicacy is stockfish. Stockfish does not grow. Stockfish does not grow in Nigeria. It's from Norway. But they cannot make any food. They cannot make any delicacy without putting stockfish. So if you say stockfish is not indigenous, they fight you. Naming ceremonies where Dr. Salaam comes from, among the non-Muslims, must have schnapps. Schnapps is Dutch. It's Dutch. It doesn't grow in Nigeria. It's liquor from Denmark. But when I was born, they used it as part of giving me a name. And you see objects, blade, liquor, velvet, clothes, which have been exchanged for a really, really long time. You see the river system as points of connection. The river Niger, the river Nile. These were great points of connections, not just within the continent, but as entry points also to the continent. We've studied, a colleague of mine, I retired, studied diseases, syphilis, gonorrhea. They were connecting points in global history, in which Africa became connected. That route has now been revived. You know what we call the Middle Passage that took slaves to the Americas? Today, that route has been revised. How? People do not know. People do not know, and I will explain it very quickly. The South American route has been revived back. It is now one of the biggest sources of the drug trade. They bring the trade from South America to West Africa, to Central Africa. From there, they move them across the Sahara. They move them to Europe. It is an extensive global trade. AK-47. People tend to assume that the AK-47 comes from the Sudan. No, it's not true. The used one comes from North Africa following the collapse of Libya and the death of Gaddafi. That AK-47 guns is part of the Middle Passage now. The South American passage to West Africa. It has now become one of the most extensive trade in guns. Had other things that connect the past to the present. Sex trade is huge. Taking African women to Europe, taking African women to Brazil in prostitution, child stealing from Togo, Republic of Benin. You and I, we don't pay attention to it. People steal kids and traffic them globally. Kidney cropping. People crop kidneys because the line, the queue to wait for kidney is so long. So they crop them. It's very depressing. By the time you combine all this, you will see how older networks are being revised. Let me begin to round up that it's not an isolated continent. It has never been isolated. It has always been relevant. Without the Atlantic slave trade, Eric Williams in Korea have argued capitalism would not have taken the shape it took. It widened the resources of the plantation, laying the basis of the modern economy of the US. The argument asks, would that economy had emerged without the use of African labor? They will say no. It has contributed to exchange of diseases globally, including now, and it has contributed to our knowledge about imperialism. You cannot understand imperialism, globalization, development, developing country without inserting Africa into it. It's part of the global South. And as we are talking now, you find an insurgency in the academy, creating what they call decoloniality, decolonization, epistemologies of the South. And I've done my own small contribution to it. I just released a 700-page book, Decolonizing African Studies. I've contributed my own small quota to understanding rituals, belief systems. And Cambridge will be releasing before the end of the year my book on autoethnography and African studies, all talking about the epistemologies of the South, how we can infuse them to the epistemologies of the North. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Falola, for this fascinating talk, which is, I guess, a great way to start our discussion later. So I would move to Professor Salaam, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Flavia, for organizing this book launch and for your kind introduction. Professor Falola provided details partly about the contributions of the book, but I'm gonna expand on it in my discussion. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about methodology and some of the conclusions in the book. In terms of methodology, in writing their surveys, world history texts or books have been based on diverse approaches, including the West and the Rest approach, and the hemispheric and interregional approach. While drawing attention to such diverse approaches using writing world history texts, Africa in global history emphasizes the religious, economic, political, social, cultural connections between Africa and the rest of the world. It also takes a comparative and interdisciplinary approach by drawing on scholarship from diverse disciplinary background, such as sociology, political science, and anthropology. Moreover, the approaches used in the book also include stressing interactions and legacies. And these issues of legacies you find mentioned, for instance, in the contributions of Falola, which is the 20th chapter of the book. And you have so many other interesting contributions that stress this. In Africa, in global history, the extent to which each age stresses the connection between Africa and the rest of the world varies considerably. This variation is tied to several factors, including the topic of the essay, the available material related to a topic, and the judgment of authors regarding how best to present the materials that each of them draws upon in their essay. Nevertheless, in stressing the connection between Africa and the rest of the world, the handbook offers continental-wide, regional, and localized narratives. Thus, for instance, a chapter situates African slave trading within the Atlantic world. Another sets music in Lagos City in a global context. Unlike many works on Africa in world history, the book covers from the beginning of humankind to the present. Thus, it briefly describes Africa's prehistory before carrying the reader all the way to the present. Previous textbooks that have also overviewed the place of Africa in world history from the beginning to the contemporary period have been periodized in ways that suggest that the start of a modern era that began with the European initiation of the Columbia Exchange and the Atlantic slave trade in the 16th century or with the imposition of colonial rule in the late 19th century. Africa in global history does not follow such conventional periodization. Indeed, unlike previous relevant works, the handbook, except for the chapter that covers the Atlantic slave trade more broadly from the period to the late 19th century, most of the essays focuses on two periods, between 1800 and since 1800. However, in focusing on these two periods, unlike previous textbooks on Africa in global history, this book emphasizes the modern period with an eye toward our world today. We take this approach not because the period prior to the 1800s is less relevant or less rewarding, but because the pre-modern era informs much of today's happenings and political discussions. In terms of its findings and conclusions, Africa in global history illustrates that war history began in Africa. And you find the contribution of Peter Michel very interesting in that volume, in that regard. The handbook also illustrates that Africa has been historically dynamic, that North African history is crucial to the understanding of sub-Saharan African history, just like Professor Palola has indicated. It also shows that Africa has never been isolated from the world, and that the impact of Africa on the world since ancient times is far greater than many people think. In terms of the impact of Africa on other parts of the world, the book suggests that within the period before 1800, various societies in North Africa controlled parts of the Middle East and Europe, or became core parts of the Islamic world, or shaped historical development in the Mediterranean world. Even before 1800, Africa also contributed to the ideas, culture, wealth, and splendor of other parts of the world. For instance, it was profits derived partly from the Atlantic slave trade that encouraged European monarchies to not only invest in new technologies or to industrialize, but also to become increasingly imperialistic in the 17th and 18th centuries. After 1800, Africa supplied Europe with important raw materials that allowed for its dominance on the world stage up to the late 19th century. And it continues to supply China, the United States, and other developed countries with such critical resources. Within this period, Africans played critical roles in shaping developments in Europe and elsewhere, including during the two world wars and during the contemporary period in which a consolidation of a global village is at the top of the capitalist agenda. Although some chapters in the handbook represent original contributions to the field, while others offer surveys, the analysis in the various chapters allows us to better understand why Africa is underdeveloped, despite its relatively large size, its relatively light population, and abundant mineral resources. Africa's underdevelopment is due to historical and contemporary factors. In terms of historical factors, Africa's underdevelopment stems from the trans-Saharan trade to the Atlantic slave trade, to the Indian Ocean trade, to the legitimate, so-called legitimate commerce, and to colonial policies. Even though it is difficult to determine whether African societies enjoy high level of products per capita before the development of the earliest of these trades, the initial and subsequent international commerce of credit system encouraged Africans' indebtedness to foreign merchants and forced many Africans to attempt to cover their growing trade deficits by enslaving people. This tendency to exchange slaves for commercial goods, which was associated with the trans-Saharan, transatlantic, and Indian Ocean trade, was accompanied by the evolution of states in which African masses were dominated by few African elites who held significant wealth, human capital, and political power. In the 19th century, the supposed legitimate trade emerged from the ending of the Atlantic slave trade that encouraged the expansion of trade based on trust, and it equally encouraged the expansion of slavery or of the use of slaves in most parts of Africa, even in societies like I studied the Sokoto Caliphate, which is located in the far interior, that even withdrew from the trade. During this legitimate trade era, African indebtedness to foreign merchants persisted, and political, economic, and social inequalities intensified, even though more centralized states emerged or were consolidated. It has been argued by Manning in another book that slavery associated with both the slave trade and legitimate trade was corruption. It involved theft, bribery, and exercise of brute force, as well as ruses. Slavery thus may be seen as one source of pre-colonial origins for modern corruption, according to Manning. In another study, I have shown how a few Sokoto Caliphate political and business elites profited from the institution of slavery. In Africa, in global history, we do not disagree with the assertion that slavery may be one source of pre-colonial origins of modern corruption. But we seek to stress that both the slave trades and the legitimate trade era were important sources of pre-colonial origins for modern inequality and related conflicts. Moreover, while the slave trades and legitimate trade resulted in extraordinarily technological and scientific proficiency in various parts of the world, especially in Europe, these benefits were less noticeable in Africa. In the end, the technological backwardness of Africa was one of the major factors which made it impossible for the European powers to impose, their hegemony on Africa. During the colonial era, European administrators eroded the authority of the old ruling classes, deprived many Africans of their traditional livelihood, and designed economies intended to meet the needs of European manufacturers. Even though colonial rule brought some benefits for some Africans, colonial policies such as those identified above have mainly contributed to Africa's underdevelopment. Or, put differently, they have mainly benefited Europe. Given that colonial policies were not primarily aimed at promoting technological or industrial development, or at least at addressing inequality and other problems of the African continent, it is not surprising that the response to the imposition of the economic system included an anti-colonial movement, neocolonialism, continual resentment against the West, and political instability in post-colonial Africa. Also, that the inequality, political rivalry, politics of clientelism, and stereotypical perception that were in African society in the pro-colonial era persisted to a considerable degree through the colonial period into the present, encourage many African rulers or strongmen to use ethnicity, corruption, nepotism, and the weakening of formal institutions as means of gaining or exercising power. Our argument in the handbook, therefore, is that African history largely explains its current underdevelopment. However, unlike some previous writers who focus on the link between colonial rule and contemporary economic backwardness, we stress that slavery and the slave trade significantly shaped subsequent political and economic developments in Africa. In terms of contemporary factors. The handbook demonstrates that Africa's underdevelopment is mainly based related to neocolonialism and local political fragmentation, political instability, mismanagement and corruption, population explosion, and dependence on one crop or one commodity, which are emerged in the wake of globalization. Economic liberalization and market reforms embraced by most African countries have increased rather than decreased inequality in the continent. And it has not helped to end the indebtedness of Africa to foreign interests, which has historical roots. Despite the economies of many African states have been expanding since the 1980s, few elites still control African wealth, while most people have been left out. In many societies, this exclusion has followed ethnic, gender, racial, or religious divisions. We argue that any attempt to maintain the growing gap between the rich and the poor can only lead to more conflict and continued underdevelopment in Africa. Because the steps taken by African countries to enhance their place in the world have so far proven ineffective, one of the suggestions in the handbook is that there is a need for the decolonization of African economies and people. Professor Falola has already stressed his own contribution, but in addition to suggesting that African economies and people be decolonized, in the handbook also, unlike previous relevant books, we also provide recommendations of what the decolonization process should look like. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Salaam. I guess, you raised several other interesting points that I'm sure can trigger an interesting discussion later. Okay, now I will move to the contributors of the book. Some of them, of course, because there were many, but here we have a small representation. I will start with Dr. Pedro Machado from Indiana University. He's a global and Indian Ocean historian with interest in commodity histories, labor, and migratory movements. He's currently working on a global history of pearl shell collection and exchange, while also developing research on eucalyptus and colonial forestry in the Portuguese Empire in the 19th and 20th century. So Dr. Machado is presenting now his chapter in the book entitled Africa and the Indian Ocean World. So floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Flavia. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for
just one thing. I would ask everybody to stay maybe within 10 minutes, so that we can have time for the questions. Thank you.
Sure. Mine will probably be about 5, as you asked originally. Thanks. So my chapter clearly had to be something of an overview, given the sort of extensive time span and sort of spatial contours of Africa's engagement with the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean's engagement with Africa. And I start from a place often where I've always sort of seen Africa, like others, as part of a broader sort of world, and indeed part of global worlds. So I think what's important to stress is the need to, as others too have called for, which is to say we need to de-exceptionalize Africa as well, right? Africa is often, the continent, this sort of massive continent with this incredible diversity, is often seen to sort of stand, at least in the popular imagination, as either outside of history, or as a sort of space that is only ever thought of in terms of, or only makes it into at least mainstream media, even while that's being challenged by, local reporters using social media more and more, that Africa is, a continent of disease, devastation, and warfare, etc. Right? It's this exceptional place, right? It has this exceptional sort of narrative. And it's important to de-exceptionalize that narrative and challenge that sort of idea that Africa stands sort of outside of, and so that's sort of where I come from. And of course, you can't understand the Indian Ocean world in isolation from the place of Africa in that world, right? Or in the world of the Indian Ocean. So Africa's always been part of the Indian Ocean. And it's been important in shaping certain processes. And the ones that I focus on in the chapter under sort of three headings are the worlds of exchange. So, commercial exchange specifically, though exchange is not always necessarily about commercial exchange and exchange of commodities. There's all sorts of different exchange, but that's sort of what my focus is. And there I come at sort of the continent and its peoples, specifically around East and sort of East Central Africa and the Horn of Africa, as important in the consumption histories of the Indian Ocean, right? And how consumption and Africa as not just supplier of labor, that sort of idea that Africa, which was certainly important, was a provider of slaves. It was a provider of raw materials. What about Africa as consumer? So that sort of helped to shape the what I call the world of exchange section, and I draw sort of broad brushstrokes across a large swathe of time to look at how also plant and animal exchanges, for instance, between Africa, Arabia, and South Asia were becoming important later than around 2000 BCE. I focus, somewhat on an area that I've worked on quite a bit, which is to say South Asian textiles, specifically cottons, which had Africa's sort of demand for those cottons, East African demand, especially places like Angoche and Malindi, for instance, and elsewhere, and Mozambique Island in the 18th century, see the importation of huge volumes of South Asian textiles that affect then that sort of level of consumption, affect then the productive capacities of parts of Gujarat in Western India. The second theme is what I call the ocean of Islam. Of course, the expansion of Islam into the ocean is fundamentally important, and African sort of, in a sense, domestication of Islam, which takes on particular forms. Early on, kind of, you get a sort of a process of syncretic assimilation, where you have a kind of mixing of local and universal practices, but then by certainly, the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, you start to see kind of local expressions of practice, and of course, along with that, also the establishment of mosques. Indeed, you have a Friday mosque, for instance, already around the 10th century on Pemba Island. At least that's what the archaeological record suggests. But then also I talk about various sorts of connections with Hadramaut and sort of Hadrami movements and migrations, but also growing urbanization and its importance as settlements sort of grow and as Islam becomes established on the coast. And certainly from the 18th century, Islam will increasingly sort of penetrate into parts of the sort of interior. And then the third section, final section, is which often many sort of know less about or don't understand as much about, and certainly students for whom this handbook, I'm sure, will also be appealing, and potentially professors or lecturers will look to use the book, is the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean, right? Which of course is very much connected to the Atlantic. I also want to say that, although I don't necessarily say this explicitly in the piece, as much as we want to try to de-exceptionalize Africa and get Africa out of its sort of area studies box, right? Professor Falola talked about how in the US, the sort of, the funding structures whereby, programs derive funding from, through Title VI from essentially the State Department and federal government, reinforces an idea of, Africa as contained within the sort of, discrete box. Of course, scholars who might get, PhD students who might get funding through Title VI, centers that get Title VI, funding, Indiana amongst them. Of course, scholars then, creatively break that box sort of down, right? But it still, in a sense, reinforces that that area studies kind of organization of the world has serious limitations, and I'm interested, I think, also in kind of in thinking about sort of breaking Africa down as it were, not into these North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, East Africa kinds of categories. Southern Africa that have particular also colonial kind of roots, and then also have certainly been influenced by a kind of militarized, if we accept that the US's kind of influence has been strong, a kind of militarized idea of the continent, which serves particular political and military purposes. Internal movements within Africa linked to sort of external currents and vice versa. These are sort of mutable and change and take different shapes. Africa, in a sense, doesn't always have one sort of one kind of shape in a sense. It's spatial geographies, I guess, is what I am suggesting, form and reform in different ways, and we sort of have to follow people, have to follow goods, have to follow ideas, have to follow texts, have to follow objects to kind of remake that, and not think of it as this kind of also almost sort of stable, I guess, box, right? And I also, in talking about Africa across the ocean and the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean, also try to, though I don't, I think, make it as explicit as I might have, get us away from the idea that the Indian Ocean then itself is also this box, right? The Indian Ocean has connections to, of course, the Mediterranean, but also to the Atlantic, right? But I sort of, again, given what the chapter is trying to do, the focus is on the Indian Ocean, where I'll just add, briefly, many will know this, I'm sure, in the audience and in this group, most of the slaves, most of the unfree people sort of exchanged in the Indian Ocean were not actually Africans. When you look at a sort of long stretch of time, it was actually South Asians and Southeast Asians, for instance. It was Asian sort of exchange of slaves that was a kind of driver for slaving in the Indian Ocean. So the Indian Ocean's slaveries are not defined by Africa's involvement in them, but Africans have certainly been, of course, exchanged as captives, involving various practices, including kidnapping, of course, but also warfare and so forth. I won't go sort of into that detail. I will also say that Africans, did not only go to places like South Asia as slaves. There was also very much African travel, right? We kind of forget this very often if we just reduce African movement to sort of forced movement, right? So, many Africans, for instance, travel to South Asia as, for example, religious jurists and religious leaders, and not only as slaves. Certainly, though, and I'll start to wind down. You get, of course, the kind of influence of African slaves in places, and for instance, politically in places like Delhi, but Gujarat as well, and also, certainly in places like the Deccan, which is kind of well known and established, where African slaves, in some cases, sort of rise up to important political and military positions and influence local politics and military victories in significant ways. I sort of chart in the diasporic, section. Also, then, of course, the legacies that these movements have left, which have been expressed in various forms of cultural expression. And I won't go sort of into that. It's there in the piece. And I guess I'll just end by saying that there's no one experience, right? There's no one history that defines how Africa and how Africans have been part of the Indian Ocean. There's certainly not one narrative that defines how Africans have been part of global history. And I think to think about Africa, to think about the Indian Ocean, means to think about global history. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting overview of Africa and the Indian Ocean world. And thank you also because if I remember correctly, it's very late at night in your time zone. So thank you for joining for the event, Dr. Machado. Okay, I think I'm next. So I'm going to present briefly my chapter, and I will help my presentation with a PowerPoint, and I hope you can see my PowerPoint. Okay, so my chapter is entitled Africa and the USA. And this is a chapter that investigates the relations between Africa and the United States since decolonization of the African continent in the mid-50s, with the aim of analyzing Africa's relation with the so-called American century, the 20th century, when the United States was the dominant superpower, and the role that the continent played in US foreign policy in this period. So the starting point of my chapter is a reflection, a consideration of a specific historical process that happened in the mid of the 20th century. On the one hand, we have, of course, the decolonization of Africa. So the moment when the African states appeared on the international system as independent countries. On the other, we have the moment in which the United States, after having consolidating its role of superpower during World War II, embarked in this global ideological, military and political confrontation with the Soviet Union. So the beginning of the Cold War. So the post-colonial history of Africa somehow coincides with the rise of the United States as a superpower and the beginning of the Cold War. We see these two processes interacting with each other. And so my chapter investigates this relation. Of course, as Pedro said, I'm giving a general overview in this chapter. In the first part of my chapter, I focus specifically on the Cold War period, and basically what I noticed is that from the mid 1950s, so the moment of the decolonization, up to the end of the 80s, the global Cold War dynamics and the strategic imperatives of fighting the Soviet Union were very influential in defining US-Africa relations and Washington's approach towards the continent. Africa progressively became part of the containment strategy of the United States and became somehow instrumental to the struggle with the communist bloc. And this was particularly evident during the 70s. In the 70s, we see the United States engaging significantly in the continent and becoming involved in many conflicts, which eventually assume the characteristics of proxy wars and had significant influence in US foreign policy. I put here just a couple of examples. First of all, the regional war in Southern Africa in the mid-70s, this chain of conflicts that broke out in the Southern African region, particularly after the independence of Angola and Mozambique, or the Ogaden War in the Horn of Africa, these border disputes between Somalia and Ethiopia, which saw the intervention of both the superpowers and again was labeled as a proxy war. In my chapter, I focused in particular on these two regions, Southern Africa and the Horn of Africa, because these two regions were probably the most affected one by the Cold War. At the same time, we see also many African countries, African actors, which also played with the Cold War dynamics in order to fulfill their own personal and national aims. So we have countries like South Africa or Zaire or Somalia, which also played the Cold War game in order to maintain a solid and beneficial alliance with the United States. So it's very interesting also when we talk about the proxy wars in Africa, the reality is that in many cases, it's not really clear who was playing who was exploiting who, okay? In many cases, we see the African actors exploiting the superpowers, the United States in this case, playing one superpower off against the others in order to reach their own national aims. And this again became particularly evident in the 70s. During the 70s, not only the Cold War became relevant to Africa and affected Africa, but the regional dynamics of the African continents, for instance, these two conflicts that I mentioned here, became able to affect the Cold War, the global dynamics of the Cold War and the US strategy within the Cold War. So the Cold War had the effect of creating a sort of overarching, unifying strategic imperative for the US foreign policy in Africa, and had the effect of linking the regional dynamics in Africa with the global dynamics of the Cold War and the US strategy within the Cold War. So as a consequence, the end of the Cold War was bound to have a deep influence in this relation in the US foreign policy in Africa. With the end of the Cold War, we see the resolution of some of those proxy wars, some of those conflicts that emerged in particular during the 70s. Again, we see the New York Agreement in Southern Africa, which put an end to that chain of conflicts, an agreement brokered by the United States. And then we see still in 1988, an agreement between Somalia and Ethiopia to solve their disputes. And so we see the resolution of some of those proxy wars, the progressive withdrawal of the Cold War influences from Africa, and the progressive disappearance of the imperatives that linked for the United States the containment of communism. And this, of course, affected the role of Africa within the US foreign policy. And so in the last part of my chapter, I analyzed a bit precisely the consequences of the end of the Cold War for US-Africa relations, for this interaction, and for US foreign policy in Africa. And my conclusion is basically that US foreign policy in the early 90s, so in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War, was a bit incoherent. We see the withdrawal of the military and economic aid to many undemocratic regimes, like, for instance, the apartheid regime in South Africa, because the freedom fighters' argument of the need to contain communism in Africa argument was no longer credible to support, to justify military aid and economic aid to such undemocratic regimes, and it wasn't enough anymore to counter the criticism that was emerging in the early 90s, in particular against these regimes, domestically speaking, but also internationally. Think about the importance of the international anti-apartheid movement. At the same time, many African actors could not play the communist card anymore to trigger the US support. Of course, the South African apartheid regime could not claim anymore to be the only bastions against the spread of communism in Africa in order to enjoy the US support. And so from the part of the United States, at least in theory, there was this, there was more attention to this kind of promotion of human rights and democracy, which was also somehow in tune with that broader rhetoric of the early 90s, the time about a new world order or the end of history, this idea that with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, finally there was no obstacle anymore to the spread of these values, democracy, freedom, human rights. This moment in the 90s in which we see also the so-called third wave of democratization in Africa. In this regard, we also see an unprecedented US humanitarian intervention in Somalia. The United States intervened with this, deployed this humanitarian intervention in Somalia, Operation Restore Hope. The United States became involved as a mediator in some conflicts, like most notably the civil war in Angola and in Ethiopia. However, it soon became clear that the directives of this new world order were not strong enough to play the same role that the containment strategy had played during the Cold War. This new focus on democracy, human rights, as well as the humanitarian rationale as justification for involvement in Africa turned out to be contradictory and ultimately insufficient to justify and support US involvement and US intervention in Africa. Actually, the humanitarian intervention in Somalia was a particularly illustrative example. The intervention was badly conceived, was implemented by the United States with the very poor understanding of the complexity of the civil war, of the situation that was happening in Somalia. And the entire intervention ended pretty tragically with the famous Black Hawk Down incident and then the final withdrawal of all the US troops from Somalia. At the same time, I mean, basically this episode showed the difficulties, the inconsistencies in defining the boundaries of humanitarian commitment and the difficulties in finding a clear guidelines for involvement in crisis in Africa. And the dismissive attitude showed by Washington in the following genocide in Rwanda, which happened just 1 year later, is a clear example. When we look at this mediator, this role of mediator in conflicts like Angola and Ethiopia, it didn't last very long. Already by the mid-90s, the United States progressively disengaged from this role. In Angola, for instance, the role of the mediator was given to the United Nations. So overall, the final conclusion of my chapter is that throughout the 90s, Africa experienced a sort of downgrading in Washington's priority. And the US relations with Africa were often characterized by an incoherent foreign policy, which was the result of the difficulties that I just mentioned in finding new general rules of conduct in a region, in a continent like Africa, where the end of the Cold War had removed an important overarching strategic imperative. Thank you very much for your attention. That was a very brief overview of my chapter. So now I'm going to stop the sharing of my screen, and I would move to our last speaker, Dr. Jody Yusu's son, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of History at Fudan University in China and a research fellow at the International Studies Group in the University of Free State in South Africa. Her research interests are focused on China-Africa relations, Cold War history in the Global South, and the global history of socialist ideas. She has extensively researched and published on these topics. And today she's presenting her chapter in the handbook entitled Africa and China. So floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And it's absolutely delighted. I'm absolutely delighted to be invited to contribute to this book volume, because as I'm now teaching African history and also world history here at a so-called prestigious Chinese university, state-run university, I realize how difficult it is to find appropriate textbook for our students that is about the right level, as well as to cover, the topic as broad as possible. So I think I would say this is one of the key textbooks reference point that I recommend to my students for my own courses here as well. And for this particular presentation, I think I'll just very briefly talk about my chapter about Africa and China and the kind of ways that I've been dealt with the topic. And I have to say that it's actually quite a nice idea to put Africa in front of China, because nowadays when people talk about these topics, it's always about China, Africa. So what is so meaningful about this topic is to have a Africa-centered approach of understanding its relations with wider world. And of course, China has been included in that perspective. And I'm sure the previous speakers have highlighted their own research in terms of how this was reflected in their own contributions. And to me, the whole story starts with the point where the imagination of Africa and its people came to the general public, of everyday life of Chinese people. That was really very later on. I would say in the 1960s, I take example of this passage written by a Chinese writer who was invited for Afro-Asian Writers Bureau events. So he traveled elsewhere on the continent, but mainly North and West Africa. And this passage actually reflected what I see the kind of brotherly stranger feeling that when logistically speaking is very separated for the two continents, but somehow the friendship, the feeling of closeness was the kind of dominant emotion at the time. So this brought us to mind this question, like how did this friendship and solidarity come from in the first place? And how about the history that has not been told, for example, before the PRC or the China that we now know today? Of course, I started with this question about the why do we have to know about that history? And if we see about the recent, especially the publications in the last 2 decades about this topic, China and Africa, many of them actually talk about the economics, the trade, and some about foreign policy, politics, and so on. But not really, in the sense that history of it has been presented in a way, in a serious way, I would say, that makes it matter. So why today in 2022, maybe that we need to know that history, and what does that history mean? So when I start with this question, it gave me the kind of two-sided, I call it two-sided epistemological challenges of writing this history. Is of course, on the one hand, we have an oversimplified what people call that dragon in the bush narrative, in the sense that it's almost like a Chinese dragon flying around in an variegated African bush, which was, of course, stripped of historical and political content. And then this gives a lot of challenge, of course, like how to understand modern China, right? The PRC that we're talking about, as its own history is quite complicated, went through several stages, reforms, revolutions, and so on. And how that changes actually meant for the engagement with Africa, especially when we had the big elephant in the room, that is the Western angle in all of this. And the second baggage, of course, is about, I call it like a moral baggage, in the sense that it was itself shaped by Africa's colonial past and racialized discourse. And we all know that there used to be a strong sense of yellow peril in the Western society. Of course, communism was also part of that history. In the sense that because both continents, if China and Africa were subject to histories of Western dominance and racism, the historical connection framework of anti-imperialist and South-South cooperation probably exemplified a major challenge to the global order, dominated first by Europe and then subsequently by the United States. So this gave us to the understanding of why Sino-African relations nowadays, we talk about it, always kind of shaped by the respective understandings of modernity, which did not necessarily correspond to the Western ideal. So that's why we have to, in a sense, to understand what Julia Strauss, a sinologist, called the historical and rhetorical lineage in China's relations with Africa. And in particular, to understand the ways in which this older Afro-Asian solidarity discourse is used to legitimize more recent political, economic, and cultural connections between former third world allies. And also that uniqueness of that relations in both the socialist and post-socialist periods is reflected in the challenge to both the so-called East-West or the North-South kind of divides. So this actually was a kind of a key driving question that I want to pursue in this chapter. And of course, it's very difficult to give an overview of everything, especially also Professor Palola also very rightly talked about the early history, especially the pre-modern history of China-Africa. As myself was a modern historian, so I focus on the kind of modern period. But I do give a brief introduction about the early encounter and about the history of overseas Chinese in Africa prior to the establishment of PRC. And in that history, of course, has been written by archaeologists and early modernists about that history in terms of what cultivated at the moment of this called the Zhenghe's fleet that actually reached the eastern coast of the continent, especially in the Lamu Islands and other surrounding islands. And also I talk about the identity of Chinese when we talk about, China, what China you're talking about, especially the history of overseas Chinese in elsewhere in, for example, in Mauritius, in South Africa, Madagascar, and Réunion. So these countries actually had a sizable group of Chinese immigrants who settled there for certain generations. So without really looking very much into detail about these early histories, you can see the periodization I had really focusing on the later period. That was from the 1949 until the current period. So it's divided mainly into these specific areas. Well, I just want to speak very quickly about the early periods. To focus really on this period is about, I would like to see that if you look at the continent at the time of decolonization, there was always a tension between the social class and nationalism, especially to any kind of Marxist-Leninist type of state. So a lot of early Soviet leaders, of course, especially Stalin himself, did not see the continent as ideal location for a Soviet-style working class revolution. But somehow China was quite unique for its own history about leading the rural peasants and also to take over the big cities from armed struggles and so on. So this actually gave a lot of opportunities for China to understand the the physical conditions about the continent facing independence. And of course, this Bandung era, which I talk about the passage at the first beginning, was this era when China really got onto the world stage and started to engage directly with African delegates. And there were lots of exchanges of visits to facilitate their understanding. And there were moments where people have to really grasp on the ground in terms of intelligence and also how to understand the demand of specific African states. And for example, one of the turning points was the second Afro-Asian conference, where China realized that actually most African representatives decided to postpone the conference because they were overwhelmed by the fear that actually, the incumbent government could be overthrown by a coup. So this actually left an impact on China's foreign policy in the sense that it had to be more careful about the ways in which it engages with African countries, especially ruling parties at the time. And then very quickly into the late 1960s, I chose my two countries as a comparison, as myself, my doctoral studies explored mainly Kenya and Zambia for my own research. So I particularly look at how this period of time where China has kind of spilled over of the Cultural Revolution, very radical foreign policy, how it ended up very differently in countries like Kenya and Zambia. So we had on the left hand, where the KANU party cadres holding placards like protesting outside China's embassy because they demanded the socialism, especially communism, to get away from the country. On the right-hand side, we also have this kind of enduring influence of a what so-called Freedom Railway. That was Tazara Railway built just for the purpose of helping landlocked countries like Zambia to export its minerals for the benefit of its own national economy, but also to support the regional liberation struggles in neighboring countries. So this is kind of a very interesting contrast for me to see how this radicalized rhetorical, but also diplomatic efforts ended up very differently and being received by leaders like Nyerere Kaunda, or in this case, in Kenya's case, Uhuru Kenyatta, Jomo Kenyatta as well. So I think this also shows the kind of African agency in terms of designing their own foreign policy and the way engaged with a so-called Cold War powers at the time. And then I move on quickly to the end of the Cold War era, in the sense that this was a very interesting question in terms of, was this really the end of history, as was suggested by people like Francis Fukuyama at the time? And then this particular quote from Professor Baswell Ogo, really interesting in the sense that he reflected about that kind of turning point of history when he referred specifically to a new type of history was in the making that was somehow located in East Asia. And in the sense that probably these he described as these people, East Asians, they chose to build the present on the foundations of the past. They argued that, like the West, where individual is the centerpiece of a democracy that is intended to empower government, in East, the tradition is one of respect for authority with the individual and the strong obligation to the group. So there was also something deep there, not only about political reform or economic liberalization, but rather about culture. So what really is a culture that probably, back to the question in terms of like why Chinese people felt close with Africans, and somehow in this case, Kenyans or Africans in general could probably felt more closer to the alternative model of development in other contexts other than the West, and in this case. So the final section of my chapter, actually, it was a discussion, very quick discussion about this idea about what I call anti-imperialist nostalgia. So why I think that even the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, there was still the enduring impact of this nostalgia. So I compared this anti-imperialist nostalgia as something, it does the opposite of the imperialist nostalgia, because it holds in mind hope for changes that yet to be realized, changes that were always yet to be realized. So this was actually an ongoing process, in the sense that the limitations of what has been achieved are acknowledged, in the sense I described about solidarity or the revolutions or the, all these kind of struggles they've been through. But at the same time, I imagine better future is pursued. So they're actually always looking up to the future. So this is not about that past, but rather about that past is written in vision of a better future. So this is, I think, the very important way to understand the contemporary rhetorics of China-Africa relations, even till today. So I call this why the terminology of third world was very powerful, and we have to really respect and understand this powerful imaginary. So in the end, I try to argue that instead of being a fait accompli anti-imperialism loosely reinterpreted as struggles against global inequality and injustice continues, regardless of the collapse of both the European empires and later USSR, encapsulated in the continuity of the slogan, "A loi continua," long after the specific deployment in anti-liberation struggles ceased to be directly relevant. So this actually posed the question about if this book was written in the 2022, and then we're going to write another book about Africa in global history in 20 years' time or 30 years' time, would that book be any different? So I think this is, all for my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was the perfect conclusion of the entire overview of the book. And we have a few minutes, and I'm happy to open the floors to questions or comments. You can either use the Q&A button on the screen or the chat function. So if there is any question, we are happy to take question or comments. Let's see.
If there are no questions.
Yes, please. I mean, while we wait for questions and comments.
I want to tell you what I want to do to continue the conversation. So I am in dialogue with Oxford University Press. They just released this book, The Handbook of Nigeria. It's a very massive book. I don't know, can you say it?
Yes.
You can say it?
Yes.
So we are in conversation whether I should do one on migration. And then our current publisher, they're also interested in the Handbook of China and Africa. So I'll be calling on all of you again to be part of the project at whatever level you want. The idea is to keep building on this book, global but now sliced, so that one chapter like the one on China becomes a whole book by itself. And I hope all of you will respond positively when we call for your support and contribution.
Okay, thank you. So the study continue, the work on this African global history definitely continue. Thank you very much, Professor Falola. Any other comment, questions?
Could I, as we wait for people,
Yes.
potentially, just ask us maybe as a sort of collective to talk about, sources and methodologies a bit more, because certainly while, of course, we have now, several several sort of textbooks written by various authors on sort of African history in Africa, in world history, African global history, where they include certainly different types of sources that students have a sense of the kinds of materials that exist. Very often these are sort of textual sources of one kind or another, and don't really fully reflect the kind of rich, I guess, source base that's available. Does the handbook, or do the editors think that, in perhaps a future kind of iteration of the handbook, a section on sort of sources would be useful, or or even possible?
Yes, I don't know who wants to reply.
I think Professor Falola should respond to that because he's more likely to know whether there will be a future edition of on this.
The publishers wanted to join us, but unfortunately, I informed her only this morning, and she's visiting Austin in 2 weeks' time. She's open to that. Now, Professor Salaam will reveal to you my sadness when they priced the book at 165. And I was very angry. Anytime you price a book at 165, you already know that its impact is limited to the libraries because individuals are not going to buy books at $165. This, I think, for now is what we should worry about. I've done big books. Cambridge sells my history of Nigeria for $32. Guess what? It's 700 pages. So it all depends on their marketing strategy. Because even if they do a second print and they sell it at $165, it's still a problem. So what we should, after this, if you authorize me to say, why don't you do paper and sell it for $30, something like that.
I think to talk a little bit about Pedro's point, I think also if we have to do another edition, we should think more carefully about including more images. I don't think we have enough in this particular volume. And then we do what you did in your book on African history, the one recently released, in which we have PowerPoint slides and other materials that could make it more useful for teaching.
Thank you. We have a question. Richard asked population growth. I'm not sure what you are referring to. If you want to tell us more about. Not sure what population growth is referring to. So Richard, please feel free to elaborate a bit more if you want. Okay, I'm afraid, oh yeah, sorry. The concern with Africa's populated growth. That's what Richard said on the chat, but I'm not sure what again what you are referring to specifically. One moment. Okay, we have another question for Jody. How useful is to continue to think and study Africa as a single entity as opposed to thinking in terms of relations with individual countries on the continent?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a very good question, actually. I mean, I think it really depends on the kind of research question you are pursuing. For example, there's always a difficulty. I mean, I'm just telling from being a Chinese kind of perspective in terms of how nowadays, this generation, we call Z generation, right? This youngsters, when they grow up, they do not really get information from books nowadays, especially my students. They absorb information more easily from social media, from video apps, and even TV programs and movies and pop culture and so on. So in this sense, I have to really make people, you know, to build up that connection for my students. And also, I mean, curiosity is the first thing, as I say. So that's why you don't want to generalize, but in case you have to generalize about the continent, because this is about, again, imagination and a continual imagination that you can't really avoid. And the second, I think, is in terms of the relations, especially the research I'm pursuing, is mainly about African relations with the wider world. Is in this way people can connect, especially for most of the students I'm teaching now. It's fairly easy for them to start with something about China, Africa, right? So some episode about Zheng He's visit, and to make them curious, and then you can develop that into something more concrete in the sense that you help them build up a understanding of Africa, not because of its being useful, but also because what it has been and what it is. So I think it's I mean, I don't know if you are doing research about it, or yeah, you're just curious about yeah, the study. Thank you.
On population growth, I think we recognize that there is this problem of population growth, and it is related to Africa's poverty, right? And it is also related to undermining the position of women in society. And therefore, to tackle those problems of poverty and to empower women, we also indicated that African states should embrace better population policies.
Thank you very much. If I can add something on the question for Jody, I kind of experienced the same problem in the chapter of Africa and the United States. Of course, it's difficult to study the entire continent in relation to the United States. It is easier to study the United States as a single country in relation to Africa, but even in this case, you have to do a lot of clearly simplifications. I think it's, of course, it's useful to study and to think in terms of relation with the individual countries, but I think it is also useful to look at the continent to identify some broader dynamics that can apply, at least in some specific regions of the continent. So of course, it's a matter of striking a balance between oversimplification and total impossibility to look at the continent as a continent, and maybe try to identify some broader pattern and some aspects that can be applied to the continent. But thank you for your question. Okay, I'm afraid time is over. Actually, we are a bit over time. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank, first of all, our public to listen to the webinar, to participating in the webinar. And of course, thank you very much to the editors of the book and to the contributors of the book, to all the panelists for this fascinating discussion and presentation of the book. And we are looking forward for the next step. As Professor Falola mentioned, this study, this analysis of African global history continues. It's an open conversation. It's an open field of research. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.